Aloha, I'm Paul Field. I taught history at Windward Community College for 20 years and have been active in History Day since it began in Hawaii. I have been a History Day judge at all levels from school fairs to the finals at National History Day at the University of Maryland. This session we're going to do today will cover how to organize my argument and develop a thesis. Now, asking questions about your topic and then doing the research to discover the answers to those questions is at the heart of doing history. It is also at the heart of arriving at a thesis. So we're going to do a little review on questions so that we're all in a good questioning mode, because this is the best way to arrive at a thesis. There are simple questions: who, where, when, and what, but the ones we're going to focus on are deeper questions. Why did it happen? How did it take place? And what difference did it make? So I'm going to go through each of these briefly, just so that we're all going to start with a good understanding of the importance of these questions. First one, why did it happen? To answer this, you're going to have to talk about context. And this is important because the judging criteria for National History Day, one of the 6 major things you have to do is place the topic in historical context. So what is context? Simple definition: the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. Now, the quickest way for you as a student to find the context for your topic is to go to secondary sources, because they will deal with everything that's going on around your topic. And it really is important, because remember, every year we have a different theme for History Day, but they all include 2 words: in history. This year it happens to be communication in history, the key to understanding. And that in history part is context. And I want to give you an example of how you can go wrong if you don't do context. Now, this happened to be when it was science and technology in history. And a student did a beautiful essay on the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. They had these wonderful things about technology, the science that was involved, but they never mentioned why it happened in the first place. They didn't mention the Cold War. They left out the context. And that shows you why context is so important. So your first question is going to be, why did it happen? Your second question is going to be, how did it happen, or how did it take place? This is the nuts and bolts of your topic, but it also can lead to a thesis. So it's an important question. And the third one, and this one is probably the most important: what difference did it make? I mean, history is sometimes described as change over time. So what changed as a result of your topic? If nothing changed, you might want to look for a different topic. But just remember, what difference did it make? Now, if you ask these 3 questions, the answers should help you arrive at a thesis, because thesis really involves answering the questions about your topic. So when we discuss the idea of thesis, all 3 of these questions will probably come into play. So what is a thesis? A thesis statement focuses your ideas in 1 or 2 sentences. It is the one statement that summarizes the main point of the project and states why it is important and worth knowing about. National History Day mentions thesis in their classroom rubrics. They state that a thesis is necessary for analysis and interpretation, which, by the way, also is one of the judging criteria. Basically, and this is really important, a thesis establishes a claim bolstered by supporting arguments. In other words, you're going to choose a topic, you're going to do your research, and then you're going to make a claim about that topic that is shown by your research. Right? It could be why it happened, how it happened, what difference it makes, but it establishes a claim bolstered by supporting arguments. The supporting arguments could include cause and effect, immediate impact, change over time, overall significance. but it means that there is something meaningful about your topic. You are asking a question and you are going to answer that question. Just to give you an idea of what happens if you don't do this and you don't end up with analysis and interpretation. I was at the National History Day contest a number of years ago, sitting behind 3 young ladies from Waipahu High School. We were watching a video, a documentary on Nelson Mandela. And it looked like it had been professionally made, beautiful pictures, very slick. It ended, and one of the girls turned to the one next to her and said, "Lots of pretty pictures, but not much analysis." And she was spot on. What happened was they had done narrative history. Now, there's a place for that, but that is not what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be coming up with an argument and answering questions about that argument. So that's what a thesis is. Remember, it focuses your ideas in 1 and 2 sentences, and it states, this is what my main claim is. So how do you create a thesis? Well, first of all, you can frequently start by writing down a thesis question. You can refer back to the first part of this for thesis questions, but basically what you want to know is why, how, and what difference did it make? So you've done your research, or at least you've started your research. You look at what you've got there, you brainstorm answers. You ask a question, for instance, if you were talking about Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats, you might ask, well, why did he do them? You'd have to go to context, the Great Depression. You can ask, how did he do them? Well, he used mass media, and it's one of the first times anybody had ever done that. You could say, what difference did it make? Well, it reassured the American people. Now, you could take those 3 questions, looking at Franklin Roosevelt, and turn any one of them into a thesis. So you ask the question, you brainstorm your answers to the question you asked, you write down the answers. You could have multiple answers to your question, but then you decide what you think is the best answer, and you turn that into a statement. Because your thesis isn't going to end up being a question, it will be a statement, right? The other answers you come up with might end up being subpoints in your program and talking about your thesis. Now, what I want you to do, since when we're done with this presentation, it's going to become an interactive session. I want those of you watching this to think about topics, your topic, your students' topics, and we'll work on them after the presentation is over. Okay, next, I want to talk about making a thesis roadmap. This is going to involve organizing your argument. Okay? You could use the word outline if you wanted to, but I find the word outline boring. I think a thesis roadmap sounds much more exciting. Now remember, a regular roadmap shows you how to drive from where you are to where you want to go. A thesis roadmap does the same thing for your historical narrative. You begin with, where am I starting? Where does my topic begin? Where do I want to end up? What are the important stops along the way? If you're on the road, the real road might be lunch, but here it might be one of your arguments. So what are the important stops along the way? Where do I make connections? Right? You ask these questions and it will begin to give you an outline or a roadmap for your thesis. We're going to spend a good bit of time talking about this with an example in a couple of minutes. But an important tip, a good thesis statement will help guide your writing and keep your argument focused. If you've got a good thesis statement, you know where you want to go. You ask those questions, where do I want to go? What are the stops along the way? Where do I make connections? If you constantly keep that in mind, it's going to help you organize and write your theoretical paper. Okay, I want to use an example here of a thesis roadmap and working with a thesis statement. I'm going to take something from European history, Johannes Gutenberg, the printing press, and what I call the printing revolution. Okay? By the way, some of these ideas come from a television series that was on many years ago called Day the Universe Changed by James Burke. So let's take a look at questions. Remember, we're going to start by asking questions. The simple ones: who, Johannes Gutenberg, where, Germany, when, around 1440 AD, what, a movable type printing press. So those are the basics we're going to start with. So now we go to why is it important, how did it happen, and what difference did it make? Now I'm going to start by giving you a thesis, right? And I'm going to repeat it at least once. My thesis is going to be the printing revolution occurred when the spread of the printing press facilitated the wide circulation of information and ideas, acting as an agent of change through the societies it reached. Now that's a mouthful. So let's go back and break it into three parts. The printing revolution occurred with the spread of the printing press. Okay, that's the first thing. And this facilitated the wide circulation of information and ideas. And the wide circulation of those information and ideas acted as an agent of change. Okay, so that's my thesis. All right. Now, how are we going to put a thesis map together? Well, first of all, this is where you are organizing your research. Now, I have a question for you. How do you compile your research notes? And I still like to use note cards. And that's because I can shuffle them, I can put them in order, I can move them around. But you'll have to come up with a system for organizing your information so that you can move it around and get it in the order you want it to be in. Okay? Now, in this case, I've shuffled my cards, and I'm going to start by saying, okay, well, we need to look at printing before Gutenberg. How was it done? Right? It was slow. And by the way, as soon as you word before, that means we're going to start taking a look at things in chronological order. This is one of the easiest ways to organize your research. So we're going to start with printing before Gutenberg. It was slow. People either hand copied books, they used block prints, but it was very slow, and written material was very expensive and very difficult to come by. Well, in 1440, Gutenberg comes up with his movable type printing press. Now, you can get lots of information about the printing press, but for my thesis, the printing press itself isn't important. The fact that it exists is important because it allows things to happen. You can spend as much time as you want talking about what Gutenberg did, but what we really want to look at was the impact of printing. And that is because it leads to the printing revolution. And this is the circulation of information and ideas. Okay? Now, let's take a look. Remember, the first thing I said was the spread of the printing press. Well, Gutenberg made his first printing press in 1440. And within a few decades, from a single print shop in Mainz, Germany, where Gutenberg was, there were now 270 cities in Europe that had printing presses. So this is the spread of the printing press. Okay? Now, this is important because printing presses could produce 3,600 printed pages per day. That's a lot of printed pages compared to Chinese block printing, which could produce about 40 printed pages a day. So the printing revolution starts with the spread of the printing press, and that allows the circulation of ideas. Okay? Now, the next thing was it allowed things to change. The printing press and that circulation of ideas became an agent of change. And at this point, I'm going to introduce something totally different. We need an example of how it allowed that change to happen. And this is where the argument gets a little more complex. But if you say the printing press acted as an agent of change, you're going to have to provide an example. The example I'm going to use, and you don't need to understand all of this, but the example I'm going to use is Martin Luther. Now, for those of you who don't know, we could go through who, Martin Luther, where, Germany, when, 1517, what, the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Now, you don't need to know all the information about this, but I want to show you how the printing press allowed this to happen. Okay? So, Martin Luther in 1517 was displeased with the Catholic Church, and he happened to be a Catholic monk, but he was displeased with the Catholic Church, and he wrote down 95 theses or arguments about what the church was doing wrong. By the way, he wrote them in Latin. Right? Now, so he writes 95 arguments, they're in Latin, which almost nobody else read. You look at this and you say, so what's the big deal? The church is going to look at it and say, okay, well, we see what you wrote, but we're not going to pay any attention to you. Well, the difference was the next year, those 95 theses were translated into German. And within 2 weeks after they were translated in German, the printers had gotten a hold of them. Copies had spread throughout Germany. And within 2 months, they had spread throughout Europe. So all of a sudden, these ideas are in wide circulation. The Catholic Church tried to suppress Luther, but he had allies who had read his ideas and supported and protected him. The result, the beginning of the Protestant Reformation that changed the religious map of Europe. Now, I would suggest, my thesis says the printing revolution allowed its things to become an agent for change, and Martin Luther would be a great example if this was your project to say, and this shows and proves my claim that the printing press created a printing revolution. By the way, one other thing you can point out, about 100 years before Martin Luther in 1415, a man named John Huss had very similar ideas. He pronounced them, he tried to publicize them, and he was burned at the stake. Now, I'm going to suggest that if it had been 100 years later and he'd had a printing press, that might not have happened. But no one knew his ideas. The printing press made all the difference. Okay, so what have we done here? We started with a thesis statement, and then we went step by step through the parts of that thesis statement and showed how that thesis statement allowed, and we backed it up with arguments showing how that thesis statement could be proved. Now, what else could you say about this? If you wanted to show more impact that this had as part of your project, you could say, well, it shows the decline of Latin and the growth of vernacular languages. All of a sudden, German becomes much more important. It's the democratization of knowledge. So if you're thinking in terms of a topic, and you've got a thesis, you go through this map building and you put down one step after another, showing how it gets you from the beginning of your thesis, the creation of that printing press, to the end of your thesis, Martin Luther is successful. Now, I hope that wasn't too complex, but we'll have a chance to talk about this once this presentation is over. Now, a couple of important points to remember. First, research comes before thesis. Do not start with the thesis and then try to make your research back it up. Do your research once you have enough information, then go through that, how do I create a thesis questioning to come up with your thesis. If you do it backwards, you might end up with an argument that doesn't hold water. So remember, research comes before thesis. And the second thing is avoid what I call presentism. What this really means is the past is very different from the present. And sometimes it's hard to understand, particularly if you were young, that things weren't always this way. So this is where context is going to become extremely important to you, because you must look at the past on its own terms. What was it like back then? And if you do that, then your thesis will probably make much more sense. Okay, let's wrap this up. And this is something which I know you're going to appreciate. A good thesis statement will be appreciated by History Day judges. Judges have a limited amount of time to consider your project. If you give them a clear thesis statement, it will provide them with the roadmap that they need to evaluate your project. So a thesis statement will help the judges. The other thing you should do, you have to have a 2-page process paper that you turn in with your bibliography. Make sure that that process paper includes your thesis statement. Right? I want to give you one last example before we finish, and this has to do with being a judge. the first year I went to the National History Day contest in Washington, which probably was about 25 years ago, I ended up judging the finals in senior documentary. I had to watch 14 documentaries. They turned down the lights, they started the documentaries, and after about the first 5, I started to panic because they were all very good and they all seemed very similar. And then I got to number 6. And number 6 had an absolutely beautiful thesis. It was clear. It told me what the student was intending to do. I got to sit back and relax and watch his presentation. And he did exactly what he said he was going to do. I had a roadmap. I could see what he said he was going to do. Here was his claim or his argument. Here were all of his supporting arguments to go along with it. I relaxed. And by the way, he ended up coming first in senior documentary in the nation. So a thesis statement is good for you because it will help you organize while you're writing. It's good for the judge because it's going to help them understand what it is you're trying to do. So I hope you enjoyed this. Good luck with your projects. And for those of you who are watching today, now we get to do some interaction. Thank you.